All right, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and we've been going over the textbook JavaScript 6th edition by Sasha Vodnik and Don Gosselin. I've already gone over the PowerPoints for all 12 chapters in the book, and I've been starting to write code. In the previous chapter, I wrote a simple miles per gallon program. All right, that was our introduction to JavaScript. And if we look, there's our book. If we look at what was done, this was the entire program. We had 6 constants that we defined up here, but the main was our driver, and we inputted our miles per gallon, we input our gallons used, we did our calculation, and we outputted both of our inputs and our output. All right, so that's what we just did. In this iteration, what we're going to do is we're going to add functions to help modularize the program. When you modularize a program, the reason that you modularize a program is to make it easier, so not if, but when you eventually have problems, you can segregate that problem into its own function. In an ideal world, if I was asking a user to input 10 pieces of information, first name, middle initial, last name, address, city, state, zip, email address, social security number, and cell phone number. If I was asking them to input those 10 pieces of information, in an ideal programmatic world, those would be 10 different functions. That way, if you had problems inputting any of the fields, you'd know exactly what function to go to. That's not the way most people write code. Most people would probably put all that into one function. Just because you should do it that way, just because you do it that way, doesn't mean you should do it that way. So, what we're going to do is we're going to take this program that now has just this in it, so I can run the program, same style sheet as last time, same exact HTML files last time, except this changed to V2 Chapter 2. And really, I guess it should probably be version 1 Chapter 2. So if I run this right now, I can run it, looks just the same, except it says Chapter 2, but when I run the program, it doesn't do anything, because I haven't put any code in yet to make it do anything. So let's start to do that. And we're going to, again, write it a routine at a time, and then test it. Write another routine, and then test it. All right? So, last time we did this. We said var miles driven equal, and we had a parse int and a prompt in there. I'm not going to do that this time. Instead, I'm going to call input miles driven. I'm going to call a routine from right there. All right? Now, my guess is, and I could be wrong here, but if I were to run this program now, nothing will happen. I knew that, but if I click inspect and I look at my console, it's telling me I don't have a routine written yet that's called input miles driven. I don't have that written yet, and I do not. All right, so let's write that next. So I'm going to go back into my program, go back to my JavaScript file here, and start writing some code. All right, so this was called input miles driven, and you'll notice there's nothing within the parentheses, which means it needs no there's no parentheses in there, which means it needs no parameters. So we'll put in here function input miles driven, and we're going to put in the same stuff we had from the last program. In other words, var miles, I'm going to call it miles this time. We could call it miles driven, it doesn't matter, but I'm going to call it miles equal parse int, the same stuff you saw before, parse int prompt input miles driven between and we had min miles, and max miles, and we are going to we don't need a plus sign here, but our default will be def miles. All right, so if I did this correctly, this is going to look exactly like it did before. It'll say input miles driven between 1 and 1,000, and then our default value will be 200. When we get done, we want to return miles. We're still not doing any error checking here. All we're doing in this particular iteration, all right, all we're doing in here is we are making sure, all right, that we are writing a separate routine for this. So we'll save. Let's run it again. All right, we've got an error. You always go to inspect, and we click our console. And it says main is not defined in the on-click. Well, let's double check that. There it is. There's main. And the problem again is left off a doggone left parentheses. So let's try that again. Still doesn't like it. Again, main is not defined in the on-click in line 20. Well, that's not true because there is main right there. Button, run program, on click equal main. That all looks correct as far as I can tell. But as you can see, it's not working. So I'm going to pause the video for a second to see if I can figure out what the problem is. All right, I think I found out what the problem was. I don't have an equal sign here. Var parse int equal prompt. All right, I think that's what the problem is going to end up being, but we're going to find out right now. So let's go back to our index file and run the program again. And lo and behold, there it is. So we're now able to come in here and input our miles. And what's changed between this iteration and the last one is in this iteration, notice main is becoming a driver. Miles driven equals this. We call input miles driven, and we take the result, which is miles, and we put that into here. All right. So let's put a comment here. Call function to input miles driven. All right. Let's go on. Now let's call the function to input gallons used. So we'll say var gallons used equals input gallons used. Okay. And I'm going to just copy everything from here that we just did and then make the changes that I need to make. All right, so this will be changed to input gallons used. And that has to be between 1 and 50. This becomes gallons used. I'll call this gallons. And we'll return gallons. All right. Now that routine should now be done. Okay. So you see, hopefully what we're doing is we're modularizing the program. Now, where we had everything before written in main, we now have three functions. Main, which calls input miles driven, and which calls input gallons used. So let's see if I made any mistakes in that routine or if it now works. So there's our miles driven, there's our gallons used. All right, so we now have two working routines. All right. Now the next thing that we want to do is we want to call the function to calculate the MPG. All right. And this is going to say var MPG equals, and we're just going to call it what it is, calculate MPG. Now, in order for the MPG function to do its thing, it needs the value of miles driven and it needs the value of gallons used. So we pass those in as parameters, miles driven and gallons used. All right. The input miles driven did not need it in any parameters. The input gallons used did not need any parameters. But since we're calculating here, it'll be this divided by this. We need to pass in both those variables. All right. This is a very simple routine, even simpler than the other ones. And we'll call this, we'll write here, calculate MPG as miles driven divided by gallons used, because that's all it is. Function, calculate. Now we can call this miles driven and gallons used. So in other words, these values that are right here, these values, those are known as actual parameters because they're the actual names from up here. In here, they're referred to as formal parameters. They can have the same name, but they don't need to. Just to show you, we'll call this MD for miles driven and GU for gallons used. All right, so we can just return here, and I like to always put this in parentheses because I'm doing a calculation. Miles driven divided by gallons used. That's it. So we have now written 3 of our 4 routines. All right, that's this one right here. So we're going to do the calculation, and whatever the calculation is, we're going to stuff it into MPG. All right, so the only thing left is to display our information. So display all input and output info, which I gave the really great name of display info. What info do we want to display? Miles driven, gallons used, and MPG. We need all of those. All right, we're working with all of those values. So right now I can run the program, I just won't get any output. But you'll notice that if I run this, inputting miles driven, inputting gallons used, it's actually doing the calculation for MPG, but we've never told the system to print out the values. So that's what we're going to do in our last routine, which again is called display info. So we've got here function display info, and we passed in miles driven, gallons used, and MPG. Here, just for something different, we are using the same name for this as its name in here. It doesn't matter. These are local variables in routines like this. And this is just going to be our alert, the same alert we did previously. So I'm going to say alert, miles driven, gallons used. Oops, there's two L's in gallons. And then again, our MPG. MPG.toFixed 2. All right, so that should be everything. Notice there's no return statement here because we're not returning a value. We're just calling the routine. So let's save this. Whoops, let's try it again. Let's save this. All right, we'll run the program again. Let's first run it with the default values. So 200, 10, and we get an error. Let's check out what our error is. Miles drive is not defined, so I typed in something incorrect here. Yep, should have been miles driven. All right. Those are the kind of errors we all make. So, 210, and there's our miles per gallon. Notice it still breaks if I put in non-numeric in either or both. We're going to fix that in a future iteration. But what I wanted you to understand is what we did in this particular example. All right, originally, we had just done a version 1 with no error checking and everything in main. Now, what's new for this version is we added functions. We modularized the program. Again, the actual program appearance did not change. All right, so that's it now for Chapter 2. In Chapter 3, I could be wrong here, but I believe we're going to write more than one program. All right, I think there's 3 of them that I've written. One that uses arrays, one that uses control flow with if statements, and one that uses control flow with both if and a loop. All right, so I will be back to start working on those programs shortly.